a modest agenda today, if we can put it like that. So that's everyone's got all the papers. Yeah, I've got the agenda.
Yes.
Okay, so we haven't got any absences other than Michael for a later item. Any declarations of interest? I mean, my only one is I am a deferred member of the scheme, but I don't believe that's a problem. Anybody else?
I'm a member of the scheme.
Okay. Okie doke. So the next item is, sorry, I've got a new machine as well, which obviously adds to the tech challenge. I find definitely, and it's a Mac for the first time, so I'm still struggling. But I think the next item is the minutes of the previous meeting, which were on the 17th of March. I think they're accurate. Any points of accuracy from anybody? No? So let's go for it for matters arising then. So I think Michael, you won the matters arising actions from that.
Yeah.
There's a 3.1 data improvement update.
Yes. So this is about whether back pay payable been included in the financial accounts.
Yeah.
And what I'm told and can see is that anything we know about is certainly included, has been accrued for. So in terms of the data improvement update, I think this one probably, I'm just going to try and think, this was probably in respect of GMP.
Yeah.
Specifically. So in the 1920, I don't think we was actually aware of the amounts at the time the 1920 accounts were produced, so there would have been no accrual at that point.
Okay.
But they have been included in 2021 on the latest estimates that we have.
Okay, so the fundamentals is where we know about things, but we've given it a poke around back pay payable to make sure we've included it.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay, that's good. The next one, I think, the next one, and the we talk about frequency of meetings, and that I didn't see that on the agenda.
No, I've failed to do this one. I need to do this. What I'm planning to do is do something in the interim, and get a paper out to the board between meetings, so we can actually do, because it's too late to wait for the next meeting to take.
Indeed.
So I was planning to get something out. I need to talk to governance as well about it, and then do something by email in the interim.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think we do need to address that this year. I mean, it's only beginning of October. We should be able to resolve that, and perhaps in that piece, Michael, you could also cover kind of terms of members and the vacancy for the employer rep, because I'm sure Michael, Hugo, and I can give you offer some good robust challenge, but actually an employer rep is quite useful, although also Hugo and I have other hats, so we have a view on some employer positions, but it would be good to have a larger employer.
No, indeed, and I do need to give I was going to pick this up on any other business, but we do need to pick up the terms, because terms of current members, 2 of you have actually lapsed in technically. So we need to go through that process as well of finding out how we actually go forward with those and get them sorted for the next board as well.
Yes, we do need to make sure we're back on regularized. I mean, we get a COVID excuse for a little bit, but not very many.
No, indeed.
Yeah. Okay, and then the was there another one? I can't remember. No, I think that was the last of the actions.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so I think the next item of business is the training, typically.
Yep. So Catherine's going to take us through some training on a couple of things that are coming up, quite important things, which are particularly relevant to the board as well. And that's the good governance review and the pensions regulators new practice, code of practice.
Okay, so I've got some slides to share, so I'll just do my best at trying to share those. Just bear with me a moment. But can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
I can.
Okay. So let me just start the proper slideshow. Okay, so hopefully you can see them large enough. Just to flag that I now can't see any of you. So if you have a question, you will need to shout, I'm afraid, because I can't see any hands raised or anything like that, I'm afraid. But please do just stop me if there are any questions.
Okay.
So as Michael said, I'm going to cover the Good Governance Project and the Regulator's new code. They're quite, both items I could go into quite a lot of detail, but obviously I'm going to try and keep it short today and at a fairly high level. But obviously if there's any further questions, I'll be happy to answer them via email afterwards, and can always come back to a future meeting and give more detail on anything in particular that you're interested in. Just to let you know as well, I apologise in advance. I've got a little bit of a cold, so I do apologise if I suddenly break off and start coughing. I'll do my best not to, but just to warn you. So I'm going to start talking about the Good Governance Project. Quick bit of background first of all. This has actually been going on really when the Shadow at the time Scheme Advisory Board were concerned that there were some perceived conflicts of interest for elected members, possibly acting in the interests of their authority rather than the interests of the fund. And there was, originally this was referred to as the separation project, because the original view was whether funds should be completely separated from the host local authority. That has now moved on, and it's now referred to as the Good Governance Project or Good Governance Review. It was put on hold in about 2015 due to pooling, restarted in 2018, and then you can sort of see the timeline from there on this slide. There's been further hold-ups due to COVID. But various phases going on over the last couple of years to where we are at the moment, which is that a report has been delivered with various recommendations made to DLUHC, which is the new name for what was MHCLG. And DLUHC is the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, which now has the responsibility for the LGPS. So the first phase of this project was looking at different models. There were 4 models looked at initially. The first was better guidance and regulation around the current structure of funds. The second one was about greater ring fencing within the funds within the local authorities. The third model was setting up a joint committee with responsibility for pension matters with representatives from the administering authority and also from other fund employers. And then the fourth model they looked at was the separate organisation, separate body to run the pension fund. So they did various bits of investigation, asked for various views, talked to unions, other industry groups, the Treasurers Group, things like that. And ultimately came out that the Model 2 was the preferred model with the greater ring fencing over the current structure. It was
sorry, Catherine, can I just ask, greater ring fencing more of funds or of decision making?
So it's around it's greater ring fencing of the pension fund management from the host authority. So it's not complete separation, but it's making things a little bit clearer about where the management of the fund sits within the local authority.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah. The joint committee didn't receive a lot of support. It was felt it would be a lot of additional admin for not much additional benefit. And option 4, there was a lot of concern about weakening the relationships with councils, who were the key sponsors of the fund.
Who pay the money?
Yeah, exactly. So that was where they were at the end of phase 1, looking at all these 4 different models. So they came out with some proposals, which was about setting minimum standards rather than a prescribed approach, and looking at the critical features, including things like how conflicts are managed, assurance about resources, how the different employers are represented on the fund. And they also proposed an independent governance review, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Some enhanced training. You'll note there that it doesn't say about the board. That's because there already are legal requirements for the board to have training, and those legal requirements currently don't exist for the committee, which is a little bit odd, but it's because local government effectively is the only scheme that has this committee structure. So it doesn't come under the legislation that covers the board, which the other public sector schemes also have. And some updated guidance. So that was the end of phase 1. Phase 2 then just set up some working groups, which include various people from across the LGPS industry and union representation and treasurer representation and so on, looking at the standards and outcomes and how the outcomes can be measured and monitored. And at the end of that, they came out with 17 recommendations, and phase 3 was then set up to implement those recommendations. So now we're going to move on and look at what those recommendations are. So this is phase 3. So as I said, there were 17 recommendations overall, and these have now been put forward in a paper to DLUHC. I do apologise if I inadvertently say MHCLG. We're all still getting used to the new terminology, so I do apologise if I slip.
The new double speak, yeah.
Yeah, so apologies if I refer to MHCLG. It is now DLUHC, but apologies if I do slip up. So the paper's been put forward to DLUHC. It's with them for consideration, and then for them to come out with what they want to do about the recommendations. So it's important to note at the moment that these are just the recommendations, but it's what the Scheme Advisory Board would like to see happen. So we're fairly sure that these will be taken forward. What we don't really know at the moment is the timescale. But the recommendations are sort of split into 5 or 6 broad areas, and the first one are just some general recommendations. And the first recommendation is that DLUHC should publish some statutory guidance establishing these new governance requirements. Obviously, until we get that guidance, we don't know exactly what's going to be in it, but it will cover quite a lot of the other recommendations that I'm just about to talk about now. The other key recommendation is that there should be a single named officer responsible for LGPS functions.
In each council?
In each fund should have should have its own single named officer. So some funds already do have this structure, some don't, and it will be up to each individual fund to work out who that person should be. It could be the Section 151 officer if they've got the capacity and the knowledge to take on the role. But of course, Section 151 officers do have a lot of other responsibilities as well.
Busy people.
Exactly. So it's up to funds to work out if that person has got the appropriate amount of time to dedicate to that job. If you actually go and look at if you wanted to, there's the phase 3 report, and in the appendix there, it does actually set out some different options of who that senior officer might be and the sort of pros and cons of different types of structures, depending how senior they are and where they sit in the organisation and that sort of thing. So that's quite interesting if you wanted to have a look at that. So that's something that funds will need to be thinking about and put in place at some point. There will be a requirement for an annual governance compliance statement to be published, setting out how the fund is complying with the statutory guidance that DLUHC will be publishing. So the senior officer will be responsible for publishing that guidance, and it will also need to be signed off by the Section 151 if the Section 151 is not also the senior officer. And the board and committee should be appropriately involved in that process of getting that statement published as well. So there's some more recommendations in the areas of conflict of interest and representation. Funds will need to publish a fund-wide conflicts of interest policy. Hackney does already have one, which is a good start, but it will need to be reviewed against the statutory guidance, because the recommendation of the Good Governance Project is that this policy specifically refers to conflicts mentioned in the statutory guidance. So obviously when that guidance is published, we'll need to update the conflicts of interest policy accordingly. The Scheme Advisory Board has published guidance on statutory and fiduciary duty. So the statutory guidance that DLUHC will be publishing must point funds in the direction of that guidance as well. And there will also be a requirement for funds to publish a policy on the representation of employers and scheme members across the fund, so the committee and board. So it'll be sort of setting out how those other bodies and the members are represented, whether they have voting rights, the rationale behind whether they do or don't have voting rights, and so on. So it's not necessarily saying that what funds are doing are wrong. It's just that there will need to be a published policy on why the fund does things the way they do things. So that's something that Hackney will need to put in place. There's some more recommendations on knowledge and understanding. There's various training requirements, which, as I said before, there's already legal requirements in place for the board. So the recommendation is that in the statutory guidance, there will then be comparable expectations for committee members. There will be specific LGPS related training for Section 151 officers. So SITFA have been asked to pull that together. Funds must publish a training policy, which of course Hackney already does, so that's a good start. But this is really about just taking what funds are already doing and sort of just formalising it slightly more, just to make sure that it covers the whole fund, not just the pension board. But Hackney's already in a good place as far as all that goes. So there's also recommendations around service delivery. Funds will be asked to produce a roles and responsibilities matrix, which sets out all the key people responsible for making decisions relating to the fund, how those decisions are made and who is responsible for what sort of decisions. So obviously some on a day-to-day level, different people at different levels of seniority will be making different decisions. And so this matrix just sets all that out. So it's just taking sort of effectively what's in the Constitution and scheme of delegation just that little bit further. It will be compulsory to have an administration strategy. At the moment, the regulations say funds may have one. So I think most funds do now. Hackney certainly does. So again, this is where Hackney's slightly ahead. But it will become compulsory, assuming, of course, DLUHC do take these recommendations forward. There will be a requirement to report against certain KPIs. So those KPIs will be set at a national level. So all funds are reporting on the same thing. We don't really know exactly what those KPIs are going to be yet. So that's another piece of work that will happen. But the idea is to get all funds reporting some things consistently, at least to enable a bit of comparison between different funds. There's also going to be a requirement for business planning. I mean, most funds do this anyway, but there'll be a requirement in the statutory guidance for the committee or an appropriate individual with delegated responsibility to be part of that planning process. And I'm sure the board will be involved with that as well. One thing that was covered in the report but hasn't been taken forward as a formal recommendation, there's been some discussion about pay policies, and noting that pension funds are often restricted by council policies about pay and recruitment. You know, there's recruitment freezes that can often affect the pension fund as well. So there was some discussion initially about whether a recommendation needed to be put in about, you know, making sure funds aren't restricted by council policies, but that hasn't actually been taken forward into the final report. Just thought that was an interesting thing to note, that it's not in the final action plan. And the last couple then are about compliance and improvements. So coming back then just to what I mentioned earlier about an independent governance review, there's going to be a requirement for all funds every couple of years to have this independent review. And by independent, that means by a separate company that doesn't already have a contractual relationship with the fund.
Sorry.
So it's not clear yet exactly how that's going to be set up. We think there'll probably be some sort of national framework with all the providers listed, and then funds can just call off from that framework as and when required. It might be possible to use existing audit providers. Until the guidance comes out, it's not quite clear exactly what that's going to look like. But that's going to be there. So obviously, being completely independent, Hackney wouldn't be able to use Aon or Hymans that already have relationships with the fund. And then the Scheme Advisory Board are going to assess all these independent governance reviews and look for some consistency and make sure they're being carried out properly and that sort of thing. And the other recommendation is to have some sort of peer review process. And what this is this came from the LGA, the Local Government Association, because apparently in other areas of where the LGA looks after councils in other areas, there's elements of peer review where people go and visit other councils and learn from each other, and sort of make suggestions of how councils can improve and so on. So there's a recommendation for LGA to consider if and how that might be appropriate for LGPS funds. So obviously that may not go anywhere. It just depends what consideration comes out of that. So the next steps, it's a little bit difficult, obviously, until we get a sort of a steer from DLUHC as to where they want to go with this. So the report was delivered to DLUHC back in February. We haven't yet had anything back from DLUHC. They've obviously got quite a lot on at the moment with McLeod regulations and things like that. So, this is sort of on their to-do list, but we don't really have a timescale when we might get anything back from it. And obviously with the recent government sort of reshuffles and everything, and new ministers and everything else that's going on, that's sort of put some things sort of back a little bit as well. But there are things that funds can be doing in the meantime. So obviously funds can start thinking about the recommendations, and if they're taken forward, how will we comply with them? So for Hackney, for example, it's things like considering who the senior officer might be, whether a new post needs to be created for that, whether it would be an existing person who take on that responsibility. Things like some of the policies that have been mentioned, conflicts of interest, there already is one, and until the guidance comes out, saying what might need to be different about that policy, there's probably not a lot that can be done there other than obviously the usual monitoring and updating of it. Thinking about creating a policy about fund representation. Training policy is again something Hackney have already got in place, as is the administration strategy. Thinking about the roles and responsibilities matrix. So these are all things that funds, and in particular Hackney, could start thinking about at this stage. But until we get a bit more of a steer from DLUHC and a bit more of an idea on the time scale, it's difficult to do too much planning, really. That's pretty much it for the Good Governance project. I did mention earlier, if you wanted to go and look at the reports, that's the link there, where you could go and find it all if you want to go and have a look at further detail. Because that is quite a sort of high level canter through what's going on, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of the sort of things that are coming up at some unspecified point in the future. Are there any questions about that before I move on to the Regulators Code?
Anybody else? I got some thoughts on it, but let's see if anyone from the committee has got any questions or wants to say something about it. Hugo, Michael?
None from me, thanks.
No questions, thank you.
I mean, it seems to me kind of quite a lot of things they're talking. I mean, there's some good practice there that you couldn't be against. Yes, we need all those things. There's a lot of public money, and there's a lot of people that rely upon it being done well, so that they get their pensions that they've earned in their retirement. So it's always worth being current. But a number of those things struck me as kind of, I'm still not sure what problem they're trying to solve, and maybe my experience is informed almost completely by Hackney's kind of pension fund and now the pension board, and so I don't understand the problem they're trying to solve. And even if you think it is about committees and funds and councils being too inward and too focused on the employer, I thought that was the problem the boards were supposed to solve. So I am a little bit confused by what Fire's been trying to put out.
Yeah, I think it's important to think that this is across the LGPS as a whole. Mm-hmm. So obviously there are funds out there that are doing a lot of very good things, and therefore probably won't have to change too much as a result of this. But there's obviously some funds out there that aren't doing perhaps as much as they could in the area of governance. So for some funds, this will be quite a big sea change. I mean, in terms of the boards being introduced, that was off the back of Hutton's report. Mm-hmm. And it was I think the boards were really aimed more at the other public sector schemes who didn't, of course, the other public sector schemes are unfunded. They don't have this committee structure looking after funds that the LGPS has. So for the boards being introduced in the other public sector schemes, that was sort of an element of governance that they didn't have before.
Okay.
For the LGPS, it was just more of an extra layer of governance. So obviously the boards are definitely adding lots of value in the LGPS, but perhaps in the LGPS where they already had this committee structure, the boards haven't maybe quite made as big a difference as they might have in the other public sector schemes. And of course, with the LGPS being funded and having all the employers, and of course, the other public sector schemes don't have that issue about funding and the potential conflicts of interest that the LGPS might have. And I think that's where this was coming from, is that there was concern that some funds, and I'm very sure that this is not Hackney, there were potentially people on committees making decisions that weren't necessarily in the interest of the funds, but perhaps more for the majority employer or the council, or their own employer, things like that. So
I mean, there was some of the topics kind of resonated. We've certainly over in the board at previous meetings have been reasonably sharp with the council when they're not getting through their administration because of other priorities for staffing at the council. And we're like, well, that's all very well and good. We understand you've got all these problems, but you're supposed to deliver these things and get on with it. And the stop messing around. Basically, we've said we've probably been nicer and much more polite with more professional language. But essentially, we've tried to perform the board's role of holding the council. So it's not just a council fund; it's a whole scheme fund. So maybe okay. So it's quite interesting, and well, I mean, I for one welcome KPIs coming back. I think they probably shouldn't have got rid of the comprehensive performance assessment. so some kind of standardisation of metrics across the sector. And I'm surprised that LGA peer reviews didn't include pension arrangements. It's a big piece of the kind of contract with local government employees over time, and so I am a little surprised that the LGA hasn't participated in this side of what councils do in the past. So I think it'd be a good thing. You'd think that they would embrace that. So that would be a quite good thing. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Interesting to see what comes out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Okay, if there's nothing else on the good governance, then I'll move on and we'll talk about the Regulator's new code, which is the other sort of big governance hot topic at the moment. So hopefully you're all familiar already with the existing code for public sector pension schemes. The Regulator at the moment has about 15 existing codes, only one for the public sector schemes, but then the other 14 cover various areas relating to different things affecting private sector schemes. And the regulators basically decided to take all these existing codes and put them all together into one, what they're calling single modular code.
Okay.
So the first phase is consolidating 10 of the existing codes, which includes the public sector code. So there's a couple of drivers for this. Firstly, it's to make life easier for the regulator to just have one code to look after rather than 15 different ones. But it's also to introduce some new legislation, which is the Occupational Pension Schemes Governance Amendment Regulations 2018, which don't apply to the public sector, but it's one of the drivers for this new code. The new code is going to be split into 5 sections, and then within those sections there's a number of modules. So different sections have different number of modules. There's 51 modules overall, but they don't all apply to the public sector. And this new code, it's not a statement of the law. It is only recommendation that it's followed, but obviously it's a very strong recommendation that it's followed, and there are expectations that it will be followed by and large by funds, and I think funds will be expected to sort of justify why they're not complying in particular areas. So this modular code was consulted on earlier this year. That ended at the end of May. We originally thought it would come into force later in 2021, but that was delayed then till spring, and now it's been delayed further till summer 2022. I think there was a little bit more feedback about certain bits that wouldn't work than the regulator expected. So trying to get that sorted is taking them a little bit longer than they thought. So we're now expecting it to be coming out in summer 2022. So there is a little bit more time for funds to start thinking about how they're going to make the new bits of the code work. So the code, as I said, is split into 5 sections with varying numbers of modules in each section. There's a new term called the governing body. So obviously, because this code applies to occupational, personal and public service pension schemes, all of those different types of arrangement have different terms. So obviously in the local government scheme, we have the committee, the administrative authority, there's the pension board. Pension board reads across to other public sector schemes, but obviously the administrative authority terminology doesn't. Private sector schemes have got trustees. So that there wasn't sort of one term that they could use. So they've come up with this idea of the governing body, and it's sort of up to funds to work out who their governing body is. So one criticism that's been fed back is for the LGPS that this doesn't really work when you've got the administrative authority with the pensions committee and the pensions board, and reading through the draft code, it wasn't always obvious who was being referred to in the term of the governing body. So that's something they're working on. So hopefully there will be a bit more clarity around that term when the actual code comes out. As you can see, there's the other 5 sections there. So what we're going to do is go through each of those sections and look at what's new in the new code. So we'll start with the governing body. So these are some of the new modules. There's a module about meetings and decision making, setting out how meetings should be run, what written records should be kept. Most of this is going to be standard for LGPS funds, should be doing it anyway. There's a couple of things that funds may need to tweak about what they do, such as there's a recommendation for ensuring that any decisions made outside a meeting are noted in the minutes of the next meeting, and making sure that officers and advisors attending the meeting are noted in the minutes, which I don't think all funds do. It does say that quarterly meetings will be expected. So just thinking back to the conversation we were having just now about the number of board meetings each year, that's something to think about. Although obviously it comes down to whether it's the board or the committee that's the governing body here, and who's actually being covered by this module. There's a new module about the role of the chair. So there should be a robust and documented process about how the chair of the governing body is appointed. There's also a reference to teaching and training being a responsibility of the chair, and it's not quite clear what that means. So that's something that we fed back in our response to the consultation. There's a new module about managing advisors and service providers. So of course that would cover Hackney's contract with Aon, Hackney's contract with Hymans as the actuary, Equinity as the third party administrator, and so on. So that this module sets out the expectations for how service providers are selected, managed, and so on. Again, that should all be, I'm sure for funds, this is all stuff that happens. A lot of it's going to be more about documenting what happens and how it's happening and so on. We've mentioned assurance of governance and internal controls there. That's not strictly speaking a new module, because funds already obviously have internal controls in place. But there is some new stuff in the module about obtaining assurance reports over and above the statutory and internal audits. So again, service providers may produce their own assurance reports, for example, that funds should be looking at. And again, that's an area that we're hoping there'll be a little bit more clarity exactly what that means for public sector schemes. As well as the new modules, there's a couple of modules that are not required for public sector schemes, but are listed as best practice. One of those is having a remuneration policy for members on the committee and board. So that's something that funds may want to put in place. There's a new module about continuity planning. That's not a legal requirement for LGPS funds, but clearly it's obviously a good idea for LGPS funds to be doing continuity planning. So we definitely recommend that funds do take some interest in that module. And there's also a module which is directed at the private sector about undertaking an own risk assessment. and funds basically sort of do this already anyway with the audit that they undertake. So it's just a question of looking through that module and making sure that funds are sort of following the recommendations. But as I say, these are just best practice, not requirements. So, you know, the regulator's not going to come after funds who aren't doing these things, but obviously they are a good idea. So just looking at the funding and investment area, the regulator doesn't have any jurisdiction over the investment side of the local government pension scheme. So there's no required modules here, just some areas that the regulator said, you know, the LGPS might want to look at as best practice. Obviously, the LGPS is unique with the public sector in being funded, so these don't apply to the other public sector schemes. But there's things around investment governance and the expectations for managing the AVC fund. Hackney has undertaken reviews of its AVC provision in the past, so Hackney's in a good place there. There's things about investment monitoring, which again goes hand in hand with the new pooling requirements and so on. And there's some things in there about stewardship and climate change, and with the requirements that will be coming soon from DLUHC regarding TCFD, all these acronyms. So TCFD is the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures, and so there's going to be work for funds to do relating to that. So that all feeds into these new modules from the regulator. But again, these are all just best practice ones, but something for funds to be aware of, that there could well be more expectation in the future that these may, particularly things around climate change, may become more of a requirement than just best practice. So definitely worth funds having a read through those. Section 3 is administration. There's 10 modules in administration, and 7 of them are new, which looks a bit scary on first glance, but actually a lot of it is what funds should be doing as standard anyway, and it may just be a question of making sure things are documented and being fed back to committees and boards and so on. So there's things about planning and preparation of administration. There's things about financial transactions in there, and that does include investment transactions, not just the administration related transactions. There's a whole section about transfers, making sure they're being done properly, the appropriate due diligence is being done to make sure that money isn't being paid to schemes that aren't proper authorised schemes. And there's things about making sure appropriate scheme records are kept and data monitoring, and funds are doing all this stuff anyway. Like I say, it's perhaps just more a question of just making sure everything's documented according to what the regulator wants in the code. So nothing too scary there. A couple of areas within the administration section that might need a little bit more work from funds. There's a whole new section about maintenance of IT systems, which is saying that pension schemes should regularly review their IT systems, make sure all system updates are documented, justify why they're the appropriate systems and so on. And this is fine for things like where funds have a contract with a software provider, but it's a little bit more difficult where it's LGPS funds using council provided systems, because the fund usually has absolutely no choice. You know, it's whatever the council decides, that's what the fund's going to use. So this is an area that funds may need a little bit more work put in, liaising with the council IT department, and potentially getting some more information from their software providers to ensure that the regulator requirements are met there. So this is an area that we've been recommending that funds do start to think about and have a look at, and how are they going to get together the information that's needed. And then linked to that, there's a module about cyber controls, and we've already been doing some work with the Hackney Fund about that. So there'll be requirements to have some fund policies in place about data breaches and cyber incident response plans and so on. And there'll be a requirement to regularly assess vulnerability to a cyber incident. So as I say, we've already been doing some work with Hackney around that. And there's potentially work to be done with third-party suppliers as well to make sure that they're not affected in the event of cyber events. Section 4 of the code covers communication and disclosure. Again, most of this is the kind of thing that funds are already doing, but it's a question more about making sure things are documented. There's a whole new area about pension scams. So this links back to the module within the administration section about transfers. So they're definitely linked, but they're listed as separate modules. Pension scams is making sure that members are not transferring their money to arrangements that then turn out not to be as robust as you would like. I'm sure you're all aware of cases that have been in the media about people who've transferred to something that it's the usual thing, isn't it? You know, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Lots of people have sadly transferred their money to schemes and then lost it all. So this is all about making sure that pension schemes are doing their utmost to make sure that members are only transferring to arrangements that are proper regulated pension arrangements, and making sure that members are fully aware of what to look out for with a scam, and just making sure that the transfer process is you know, as above board as it can be to avoid anything going wrong. And then there's a new module about general principles for member communications, and this is all pretty standard stuff, so shouldn't be an issue for funds. Again, it's probably more just a question of making sure everything's documented. So it's you know, pretty common sense stuff about plain English, making sure it's available in the right format for people to access, and so on. The last section is reporting to the regulator. There's only a couple of modules in this section, and this is all stuff that funds are already doing. So it's just making sure that the regulator's told of any changes, employers joining and leaving the fund, any changes to the contact details of the scheme and all that sort of thing. Breach reporting comes under this section, but that's something that funds should be doing anyway. So there's not actually anything really new in this section for funds to worry about. It's just carrying on doing all the things that they're doing as it is. So in terms of next steps, as I said, we're expecting the code to be in force in summer 2022. Hopefully there will be a few changes. It wasn't always clear in the draft code exactly where something was a requirement for the public sector and where it's just recommended good practice. Sometimes even within a module, the wording could be a little bit inconsistent. So we're hoping all of those things will be ironed out. We're hoping there'll be a little bit more clarity about the governing body terminology to make sure it's clear, particularly in the context of the LGPS, whether it's the committee or the board, or you know, who is being talked about in this particular module. We're not expecting any major issues for the Hackney Pension Fund. Hackney's already doing regular compliance checks against the existing code of practice, but obviously there are areas in the new code that are going to be new to all LGPS funds that will need a little bit more thinking about, particularly, like I said, the ones about IT and cyber and so on. So we don't think there's going to be any major issues for Hackney to worry about, but there are areas to start thinking about, which obviously we're doing with Michael and Lucy as part of our governance role. But really, it's just a question of watching this space until we hear a bit more from the regulator. And that's it, unless there's any questions about that.
Hugo, Michael Hackney, any questions?
On one of the earlier slides, Catherine, you talked about record keeping, which I think we all know, but there was also a mention of data monitoring on that slide as well. Is that something new or something slightly different to what we're already doing?
It's not new. I mean, there might be some slightly different wording in the module, but no, it's that's something that funds should already be doing anyway. It's already a recommendation in the existing code that funds have a data improvement plan that's regularly monitored and so on. So yeah, it's nothing particularly new, just a continuation of what funds are already doing.
Just reporting on your common and conditional data and having
that sort of thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing that strikes me, I guess we've got quite an interest in kind of how the governing body construct develops, and because I suppose we expecting the pension fund and us to be clear about who has what, and without being the roles and responsibilities. So I think that will come out in the wash. As a question for Michael Honeysett, really, I think probably is about is the Hackney Fund comfortable with this, and are they taking any steps, or they're just waiting for it to finalise all the rules before they do it?
Yeah, so a mixture really. So there are some things where we do, I think as Catherine said, we do just need to sit and wait and see what comes out of the wash. But equally, we are doing some work already on certain areas. So the data stuff, we're doing data flow exercise with Aon at the moment across both us and all of our contractors to make sure that we've got that fully documented and we understand where risks, etc. are. And obviously, we're going to have to wait and see around things like who the governing body is. I mean, my own view is in Lgps, I'd expect it to be the committee, given that they're the decision-making body. But we'll have to wait and see what comes out of that, obviously. So it's mixed. We are working on some of it through specific projects, and others we do really just need to wait and see. But I don't think there's anything major in there that would worry me particularly. I think we're already doing a lot of the stuff. We just need to make sure it's documented, etc., going forward.
Yeah,
fair enough. Okay, any more contributions from anyone? No?
As I say, if anyone's got any further questions once they've had time to think about it, I'm happy to pick those up sort of outside the meeting. Michael I'm sure will be happy to pass anything on. And Michael has got a copy of the slides as well, which I'm sure, again, he'll circulate. So
I was just going to say,
I should have said that at the beginning, shouldn't I? Sorry.
Yeah, I will circulate those after the meeting so you've got those. Everyone on the board's got them.
Thank you, Catherine. It was clear as ever. Appreciate it. Okay, so the next item, we go back to my agenda now. I've worked at this. So Pensions Committee review of their work from April to September.
Yep, so that's obviously me. So obviously since the last board, there's been 2 actual meetings. So one was in June 2021, and the other one just a couple of weeks ago, actually, at the end of September. And in addition to that, there was a specific workshop held on the 22nd of September, which was around the work that's taking place on developing the responsible investment strategy and policy. And particularly looking at, looking at the overall wider responsible investment strategy, but also starting to look at a refresh of the climate change target as well, because the current target's coming up to the end of its 6-year life. So if I just pick out the main points that are more relevant for the board from the meetings. So June 2021, there was a funding strategy update, which actually looked at a couple of things which are really regulatory changes, which allowed us to look at options on exit credits and other employer flexibilities. And this is really making it clear. So if an employer in the fund is actually reaching the end of their contract and due to leave the fund, what actions the pension fund would take and what policies they'd apply to any exit credits that are actually might be payable to that exiting authority. So if they've left with a surplus on their part of the fund, laying out where they'd be able to ask for refunds. So for example, the main thing really was in the policy was that we wouldn't pay out any exit credit that was due to market performance, because obviously market fluctuates up and down. You could pay out a big credit at one point in time, but they might then come, over time that might have disappeared. Whereas if their surplus was due more to actual contributions from the employer, then we would look at that and see whether there's any surplus exit credit actually due to be paid back to them. So that was the main part of the funding strategy update. The employer flexibilities we brought back to September committee, so I'll just come back on that when we discuss that one. There was a paper on actuarial funding issues and updates where we actually looked again at some issues that we obviously need to make sure are dealt with in terms of the upcoming triennial evaluation. So that was really making sure we look at the data again. So this is in terms of member data cleanse, etc. I think we've had many discussions about that in terms of the interface, which again I'll come back on to later. But also looking at the potential for early contribution modelling. So this is trying to get an early view of where the fund might be in terms of its funding level and contributions due from different employers. And actually bringing that forward, it's something that could be done quite early on in the process, providing we've got good member data. And then the other thing was really an update on the 95k cap. I think at probably the last meeting, we was all worried about the 95k cap, but as we know, that actually got taken back out of the law. So it wasn't actually, well, it was rescinded quite quickly.
Mm-hmm.
There was a regulatory update report which really talked about the stuff that we've just had the training on. So the main parts of that were around the pensions regulator code of practice and the good governance review. So I'm not going to go into any more detail because obviously we've said quite a good training session on that. And then there was fund administration policy updates. So these were basically quite minor updates to most of them. So the voluntary scheme pays, we already had obviously a policy on that. This is around where there's a tax liability that the fund might be able to pay up front, and then the member basically pays back through reduced benefits once they're in pay. And really that was an update in respect of income levels and annual allowance tapering. It also looked at the communication strategy, and again that was really around the triennial review, making sure it's in line with the dates for that, and again the TPR's potential issues coming out of the pension regulator's new code, and also linking it, so the administration policy, to that earlier thing I mentioned about the exit credits. So we updated to make sure they're in line, and also there was a section in there about cohabiting partners and their right to pensions, etc. So those were the main changes to the administration policy updates. At the September meeting, there was an item on cash flow monitoring, which is obviously quite important. I think as board know, or hopefully know, we've always been cash positive for many a year now. We still are cash positive, and actually quite strongly, but we are certainly moving to the point where we do monitor it regularly, where we do need to keep an eye on that, and actually keep in mind that we could go negative in the next couple of years, and actually take that into account in our investment strategy going forward, because what we don't want to be doing is obviously being forced to sell at a point in the market when it's not good to, so we need to keep an eye on that. Again, funding and investment considerations we looked at, and this is really around potential for de-risking, etc., and the stuff that I actually spoke about just now about doing an asset and liability modelling up quite early on in the triennial review process. Employer flexibilities, as I said, we took a further paper on this to the September committee, and this was really looking at deficits on exit and how they might be repaid, so the opposite to the exit credits, and with the circumstances where we'd look at deferred agreements with exiting employers. They were the main topics which would directly impact on the work of the board. A lot of the other stuff at both committees was around implementation of the investment strategy that was agreed nearly a year ago now, and also obviously there's lots of work going on around responsible investment work, etc. I will just for information for the board really, so in terms of implementation of the investment strategy over the last couple of weeks in particular, we have just made some quite big changes on the mandates. So we've actually moved round about, it's just shy of £500 million, so it's about a quarter of the assets of the fund over to the CIV, London CIV, and that's in 3 different funds. We've gone into their emerging markets fund, Bailey Gifford global fund, which is more sustainably focused, and also we've moved out of GMO's diversified growth into the LCIV's diversified growth fund. That was more around, well, met two two things, because the GMO was not performing particularly well over the last couple of years, and also it fulfilled some more of the pooling requirements. Yes, I'd say in terms of upcoming work, so there's been a section obviously in the reports which deal with those. I think the upcoming work is obviously finishing off some of the major projects that we've got in place. There are a couple of reports coming up, where specific reports on this meeting, which we'll discuss those. But a lot of the work over the coming months is going to be around definitely final stages of the investment strategy, further work on development of responsible investment policy and carbon targets, with a view to actually setting a new target by the end of March next year. And of course, we've got the triennial valuation coming up, so we're doing a lot of prep work on that now, alongside agreeing the annual report and accounts, of course. There is an additional meeting of the pension fund in November, largely because of the sheer amount of work that is going on at the moment. So we've taken the opportunity to use one of the options in the current allowances to actually use an additional meeting.
When's that?
That's November the 23rd. So we'll be taking the annual report and accounts there for noting, etc. For one of the things, and some more updated policies, etc.
Okay.
So yeah, any questions on that, really? Sorry.
Here you go, Michael Hackney.
You have a couple, Michael. You mentioned about the CIV, and they did come to a previous couple of board meetings in the past. I just wondered if there's any plans into a future board meeting.
We certainly, I'm not averse to that at all. We haven't spoken about it, but I'm sure they'll be happy to come, and we can bring them to a future meeting. It might be useful actually, because we have changed. There's things going on around the governance to see if it's improved its working with the local authorities, etc. Which be useful for board to hear from them, I think. So I can arrange that, certainly.
So many views.
I mean, it'll be interesting. Don't get me wrong, Michael, but kind of why are they coming to see us?
Yeah, I suppose. Oh, sorry.
No, go on, Michael. After.
I was going to say, certainly, obviously, it wouldn't be about particular investment functions, etc., because that's not part of the board. But given that, I think there is a lot. Obviously, given they're managing probably 75% of their funds, we need to make sure the governance around that, I think, is right, and we are having the opportunity to properly engage with them, etc., and indeed the fund managers that they're employing for us. So I think it's more the governance and admin side of it, and making sure that's what. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the governance is the only piece, and then we have to be quite specific about the governance piece. I mean, in the stuff Catherine just been through with us, the governing body, when there's they're using things, when the fund's using devices like the CIV to do that stretches even further the kind of the governing body concept, really, doesn't it? It'd be interesting to see them. But I think it's about governance is probably what we want to see them about. And we could find lots of other interesting for people of a certain persuasion of it, what their interests are, things to talk to them about. But maybe about governance.
Yeah. Okay.
Was that all? Something else?
No, there's a couple of other things. I was reading, I think it was the September meeting, there was talk about an operational issue about ID documents and post-COVID administration processes. And I was just surprised to see that we still insist on original birth certificates and passports.
Okay. So during COVID, etc., we didn't actually said we'd have copies, etc. But
I know you did.
Yeah.
And so my question was, there's some like electronic ID&V processes out there that I've seen. You can do it electronically rather than insist on original documents. I just wondered if that was pursued.
Okay, I can certainly take that up with the team and have a look at what the option, whether there are any options. Well, there clearly are options. Whether we can make them work for us and indeed the members. Yeah.
I mean, I think they will have to at some point, and maybe, you know, surely the people starting to be thinking about their pensions are going to be pretty comfortable with some of these things. So, you know, it's going to, the impetus from scheme members alone will drive this one over time.
Yeah.
So we need to get ahead of it.
Yeah, and I think we can actually, because we're developing the member
portal.
Web portal, I think we can certainly use, because obviously the whole idea behind that is to actually bring the fund up to date in lots of areas around that, and so we can start thinking about use of that, I think, for that type of thing as well.
And my final point from looking at those papers was around the number of opt-outs. I didn't know if there was, did we have any concern at the level of opt-outs? Did the council have any concern in, you know, COVID times that people are maybe making the wrong financial decision that's going to impact them in the long run?
Yeah, opt-outs haven't increased by any big amount. So what that is as we get new employees, etc., they're automatically enrolled, and if they don't want to be enrolled, then they will opt out. And so you do get a number of new members or new people that just opt out straight away. We haven't seen a significant increase in the number of opt-outs. Obviously, it's something we do keep an eye on for a number of reasons. One being to understand why, and whether, because we get different people coming to us saying, oh, you've got lots of members opting out because of this, that, and the other, and there's no real evidence of that. So we do try and monitor the reasons for it. So most of it is due to what I've just said, it's where people are automatically enrolled and then they just don't want to be part of the fund from the start. So
thank you, Mike.
Yeah. Okay.
Hugo, did you have any questions?
No, I agree with Michael. I think going forward, you could easily implement some online AML process, which would save members a lot of time and hassle.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. I didn't have anything in particular on that one. So next is the annual benefit statement. Palaver first, yeah. Let's get this world of pain over with.
Yeah. So I mean, this report says, sorry, it's the, on my screen I've got private caller showing. I'm assuming that's Mike Mordecai.
It is. Sorry, I was on mute. I was put on mute.
That's okay. That's good. So obviously, I've done a specific paper, which obviously with information that's come from Mike's team at Equinity. Sorry, Mike Mordecai is the relationship manager, contract relationship manager at Equinity. I asked him to attend the meeting because of, as set out in this report, there have been major issues with the issue of annual benefit statements this year, particularly around the deferred benefits. And I thought it'd be correct for Mike, as because Equinity actually carry this exercise out on the fund's behalf, to actually be able to answer any questions and any reassurance they can give around the work they're doing to one, put the situation right for this year, and two, make sure any lessons learned, etc., are actually implemented and to avoid the issue for next year.
Although that does appear to be what we do every year, is talk about the lessons learned of this year's failure to get it right, and then also that we're not going to do it like that next year, and then Groundhog Day happens again.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, as set out in this paper, I think the disappointing thing for us at our end of the operation was that there have been improvements over the last year or so, and obviously we've to a certain extent this has caused us to go back, having to report a breach to the pensions regulator, which we haven't had to do for the last 2 years. So that's particularly disappointing for us, and the reasons behind it, which I'll leave Mike to actually explain.
Mike, would you like to talk to us about this?
Yes. Hello, everybody. Yes, my name's Mike Mordecai. I'm the Public Sector Relationship Director, so I oversee your account. So just to give you a bit of background as to what happened this year, as Michael said, the project was moving pretty well up until a few weeks ago. And just to give you a bit of background, our annual events team, which is the team that runs these kind of things, was restructured earlier in the year, and our subject matter expert stroke lead for your account has been reporting into a new management chain. I think the paper references the breakdown in communication. Essentially, we were having some staff issues with sickness and all the rest of it, and essentially the regulatory deadline for the deferred statements wasn't communicated through that management chain, and therefore a manager made a priority call to continue working on the active statements rather than the deferred statements. This was compounded with this individual not communicating that decision to anybody, so neither I or any of the rest of the senior management team were informed that was the case. So it was a decision that this individual shouldn't have made in isolation, and that's a major communication stroke project management governance failure, that deadline was missed. So that's essentially how the problem came about. What are we doing to try and fix this problem? We have appointed a new head of annual events team who has got a brief to completely shake that team up. As you referenced before, there have been issues in the past, and the guy's name is called Richie Lockhart. He's now chairing daily calls for your particular project. So we're getting daily updates. It's been managed much more closely and with much more attention. But I think more widely, as I say, his brief is to come in and really start with a blank sheet of paper within that team, and look at kind of resource and capacity planning, because one of the key issues here has been, I don't think there are too many single points of failure. So we're having a blank sheet of paper in terms of resource capacity planning, the skills mix required. We're looking at all of the systems that we use to produce your benefit statements, because some of them are pretty clunky, they're old, and they're not very transparent for our reconciliation purposes. So actually tracking what's gone and what's not, and the reasons why they haven't gone, and really sort of looking at a sort of more lean approach and a more carefully controlled project management approach. So that's our plan going forward. In terms of the remaining statements for this year, we will report probably 2 or 3 times a week, just to keep the Hackney team updated on exactly where we are. And we're aiming to get everything out by the end of the month.
By the end of October?
Yeah.
So you think everything will be out by the end of October?
It's subject to, we're getting to the hard cases where there are data, potential data issues. So we'll be liaising with you where we require, additional employer data, or we've got data queries. So I can't guarantee that every single one will be out by the end of the month, but that's certainly our intention in terms of, as I say, as you can see in the paper, there are a few hundred still where we are looking at data issues. So we will continue to kind of communicate where we solve those, or if we have to come back to the scheme to request additional information or any clarifications around kind of base data.
The bit that I struggle with, Mike, I'll be honest with you, is in the deferred members. Okay. The set of deferred members is a set that unless I there's another source them that deferred members come about, the same set of deferred members we had last year, except that set that we had last year that you produced statements for on time reduced because some of them have gone into payment or have, you know, taken their portion of pension and gone elsewhere, or they've come,
Sure.
They were active members who are now deferred because they've left the employer that they were with that enabled them to be in our scheme. So both of those pieces, so where people have left, there are fewer people. And so new deferred members are people who are in our active scheme. So I struggle with this, they're really complicated bits of data. And these are, you know, I agree that deferred members may well have a rich set of data about them. But if we did it last year, why is this year, is that data set causing us trouble? That's the bit I don't understand. Do you see my question? It's as though we've just chanced upon this set of deferred members that we have to do benefit statements for, and like, oh my goodness, they're quite complicated. Yet Equinity's been the administration doing this administration for how many years?
I agree in that, and I think I referenced our systems for producing this are not very transparent in terms of, you know, why are we getting these data issues and all the rest of it. Now, you know, the lack of a working interface is a constant issue, and obviously we've got a project ongoing to start getting employer self-service in. So it's not clear to me either, to be honest, as to why we keep hitting the same problems, and which is why we are starting with a blank sheet of paper here. So yeah, there are too many manual processes. There are too many manual checks. So I agree. It is like we are looking at this for the first time every time, and which is why we brought somebody else in just to come in and start afresh and understand why we are having the same issues every year.
Can I ask you another question? Sorry, Mike. Are Hackney the only people that have these troubles, or do you and all your other employers that you do this for, everything's smooth sailing, or do you have these issues with other employers?
I think Hackney is, I wouldn't say unusual, but it's you know, the size of the scheme not having a working interface, and for the number of employers that you've got is a little bit of an outlier. I mean, obviously we've got lots of multi-employer schemes, but I think those two things are do make it slightly unusual, and which is why I've been very keen to push forward on the employer self-service thing. Now, obviously, that will take a little time to for that data to come through, because obviously, you know, it's a final salary scheme or, you know, care scheme. So, you know, the best of the last 3 years, so the data quality will start to will start to improve over a period. So I think that's why, and I think, as I say, we do have, as I say, just historically, we've only had a couple of people really who, you know, understand the scheme sufficiently well, and that's where we end up with, you know, that's where we end up with a single point of failure. You know, somebody goes ill, or and we automatically have an issue around resourcing. So, which is why I think, you know, that kind of capacity planning and ensuring we've got more than one subject matter expert and people who, you know, who understand your scheme and the nuances of it.
Okay.
I'd say that's.
I mean, I've seen Michael and then Jackie, Michael Hannisett and then Jackie. I mean, they do reflect our scheme's got no, you know, the scheme's the same as last year's scheme, and you manage the benefit statements then, is partly what I'd say. Michael.
Can I just say, given the main issue is around deferred members, I'm not sure how the pensions data service, our interface, is actually going to help, because that's more around active members and people actually on our payroll. And also, one of the main causes of this problem was really the fact that the deferred members' statements have been deprioritised. That's what we've been told was the main issue. So that doesn't quite tie up with the reliance.
Well, yeah, I mean that's.
Well, hang on a minute.
Hang on a
minute, Mike. I'm going to take Jackie as well, rather, and take all questions, comments at this point, and then I'll come back to you, Jackie.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that, bearing in mind that, Chair, you raised the fact that this issue is not new and it's come up for several years, and it's going to be better next year, as we keep saying. I wonder it's worth, rather than waiting to this time next year, whether we the board would like an update on what action has been taken, like before the event. So effectively at the next board, maybe a clear action plan from Equinity in terms of what it's doing in advance of the next board might be helpful.
Well, we would always like to, and I assume that the pension fund itself is receiving frequent updates on this one. And so, yes, I mean, I'm loath to divert resources that are fixing this problem to tell us that they're getting on with it. Rather, the problem was fixed, and then somebody shares with us how they got themselves into that pickle. And it's hard not to see that it is something about, and you've been pretty open about it, Mike, is there were project management and prioritization issues at Equinity. I suppose I still struggle to understand that an organisation of yours, which so engrossed in this topic, that the fact that the deferred set needed to be produced by that point was a surprise. So I overall processes, but yes, I mean, I think we want it fixed, obviously, and I'm sure that's what pension fund have said. And then when it's fixed, we want to know how it happens and how you're going to make sure it doesn't happen again, and how we can be confident that your assurances are we can trust them and believe them and trust in them. Would be where
I agree, and it will be a specific project looking at, as I say, with the new head of annual events, Richie, that we will be overseeing. It will be run as a project, and we will report on it as a project in terms of those improvements. So we will certainly report.
Yeah, I mean, at this stage, we just need it got through, and I'd like to say thank you. I did get my deferred benefit statement.
You haven't enough during the year, have you?
No, that's relevant. Don't make that out in our form. Okay, Michael, is there any, I mean, Mike, obviously, I'm sure you didn't want this to happen, but yeah, we'll expect to talk to you about why it's not going to happen again. After you've got the statements out. I think the focus now is getting the statements out.
Yeah, it's getting the statements out.
Yeah, and then subsequently we would like to understand how we can be confident that this won't happen again. And some of the stuff you said sounds like going in the right direction, but kind of as you've got to the end of the process, then we'd expect to hear from you again on that one. Mr. Honey, is there anything else you want to add on that?
No, the only thing I would say is, so in the cover report, I did mention that we'd obviously report the breach to the pensions regulator, which has been done, and the initial the response I've had back from the pensions regulator is that they're minded not to take any further action at this point, provided we get on and sort the problem by the end of October, in terms of getting the remaining statements out by the end of October. Obviously, if we're not, I'd need to update them at the end of October as to where we are. So hopefully we will get them out. I'm sure, as always, there will be a few which don't make it, but I don't think that would bother the pensions regulator, because there will always be data issues around some.
There's a little bit
are out.
Okay. All right. Well, then we expect to see in a future meeting something that takes us through kind of how this won't happen again. Yeah. Any more from anyone on this item?
I just wondered, there's definitely something about controls, about reporting to the authority about progress and decision making within the team itself. But it sounds like these data issues were a surprise. Is there an argument to doing something earlier rather than wait until the project kicks off? And milestones during the year, every quarter, to look at maybe newly deferred members or the data issues that you experienced last year, to try and resolve them well before the deadline, so we don't have to do another report.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of thing I'd be hoping to see, those sort of reflections I'd be hoping to see in, once the statements are out from Equinity and the council, about how they're going to make sure this doesn't happen again. Absolutely, I think those are the sort of things.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, agreed.
Indeed.
Okay, Mike, I don't know if you're staying for the last item. If not, thank you for coming. Get back to getting those statements if you're not staying.
I'll get back to it. All right.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. Thank you.
Yes,
Bye-bye.
bye. So, major projects update. Is that you, Michael?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So I think previous boards have had updates on these around. There's three what we call major projects ongoing. There's the GMP rectification. I think at the last board we set out the funds, what the committee had agreed in terms of the process for overpayments and underpayments, what we would be reclaiming, what we would be writing off, etc., etc., and then was hoping that we would have made all the correct physical corrections by the time of this board, actually. I think the update in this paper on GMP is nearing its end now. It was, the actual rectifications were deferred for a couple of months, and that was because they were at Equinity's end. It would have caused issues on the system with the timing of them around pensions increase and things like that. So it was felt a better job and more accurate job could be done if it was just deferred for a month or two. So it was. All the communications have now gone out to all members, both those overpaid and underpaid, as a result of the GMP reconciliation exercise. And the underpayments are being corrected in the October pensions payroll, and then the overpayment cases will see their corrections in the November pensions payroll. I think the important thing from this point of view is obviously to remember where people have been overpaid. The fund made a decision, the committee agreed the policy that they wouldn't be seeking to actually recoup that overpayment, but we are legally obliged to actually correct the pension going forward, so that will be taking place. What we have asked Equinity for is, because they're dealing with communications on this, because obviously that's the business as usual, effectively, and they will be reporting to us on the actual comms that come back. So if they get complaints, etc., what they are, and if there's any specific cases where we need to be involved in actually dealing with them, if there's like hardship, etc., coming out of it. So we're expecting that update around from Equinity around the communications and any response to that. But that project is now very near its end, in effect. The other big project is the ongoing work on the McLeod remedy. I think all the work streams on this that need to be running are running now. We're still waiting for confirmation of the actual regulatory changes that will take place, but we're working on the basis that what we've heard so far and have been seen in statements, etc., is actually what should end up being in the latest set of regulations, and we're proceeding the project on that basis. Again, the main issue for us on the McLeod at the moment is data, and it's the data for us, because of the cyber attack. We lost payroll data between April 14 and when we had the new payroll in 2017. So there's we looked at various options around that, and that was the backup from that was taken. Unfortunately, that was caught up in the data cyber attack. But what we have done is worked with Equinity so that they can put that information back together from the monthly data that they've had. So that's what's actually taking place now. Overall, I think that project is pretty much on track. It's where we'd expect it to be. I think there's a couple of smaller employers where we still haven't had the data, but we are chasing, liaising and chasing those. Obviously, we're just continuing to monitor any further risks and awaiting the outcome of the actual regulations when they come. I think we're expecting draft regs by the end of this year. The last one is whilst it's a very short paragraph, a couple of paragraphs in this report, is obviously a very important one. It's the pensions data service. So this is the ongoing. We've spoken about this at many boards about the data that comes across from the payroll into the pensions system, and the development of an interface. And I'm pleased to say it, we're finally very near. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel at last on this one. A lot of work has gone on between having the right people in the room, actually having people from iTrent, so our payroll providers, Equinity, obviously the pension system, and our own officers, etc., along with people, Catherine, etc., from Aon, just to guide this project along. And we're actually at the stage now where we've produced several files over the last couple of months, which have been thoroughly reconciled back to systems in terms of contributions, etc. They've been backwards and forwards between iTrent and Equinity, really trying to sort out any issues around the actual data, making sure it's picking up different fields correctly, etc. And I think we're at a position now where we're looking at October files are really looking as if the go live ready, really. I think the important issues will be going forward, once it does go forward, is making sure our payroll keeps on top of any rejections that come out of that data, so we don't end up with a backlog, and making sure the procedures and processes are consistent across the two payrolls, that departments in Hackney, and that data that Equinity then picks up and takes into the system. So there's a piece of work to do now about actually setting those processes and procedures out on paper and making sure everyone knows exactly who's responsible for them and when they need to be done. But it's definitely, we're nearly there on this one, I'm pleased to say, with real files that are actually looking fit for purpose now. It has been a long road, as you know. So.
Absolutely. Hugo, any questions, comments? Michael Hartney?
Not brilliant.
No.
I mean, it would be great to get to get the data interfaces working, and I absolutely endorse. Once you've got it working, you can't let any teeny tiny slip go, because then it all goes terribly wrong. So you need to on top of it all quickly, while it really is so straightforward, and it's never straightforward. But it's a small problem, but you can sort it out, and it might tell you stuff about big problems coming as well.
No, indeed, it's about keeping on top of it monthly, so any rejections are dealt with within that month, so they don't. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it would be a terrible shame to get to the end of that and then let it degrade over time.
Yeah, no, indeed.
Yeah. And the McLeod stuff, that's just because of the data, the cyber attack. There's not any other issues from the Hackney data.
Catherine, correct me if I'm wrong on this, because she's been on all the calls, but I think the main issue is, no, it's certainly been the data around that cyber attack. So I think we've had the data from the payrolls other than that. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything else. Obviously, there is ongoing data collection from the other employers as well. I'm not aware of any significant issues there. I think some of the employers haven't replied yet, but that's sort of ongoing, and constant communication with them to get the information that we need. It's a little bit tricky where people have moved between employers.
Yeah.
That's a little bit trickier, but I'm not aware of any significant issues. No.
Okay. All right. Well, it looks like things are progressing. That's good to hear.
Indeed.
Okay, I think we're now on to any other business. Are there any other items of any business you've got, Michael? Honeysett?
No, I did say to my email, I'd mentioned about the terms, but I'd picked that up under the minutes, so about making sure we get the
so
recruitment, etc., sorted before the next board.
So you will correspond with us about that and terms and meeting frequency, and somebody will talk to us about dates as well in case that's probably Jackie.
Yeah, it's just probably worth mentioning that Rachel's now back from her maternity leave and is on a period of extended annual leave. Obviously, she's accrued that leave, so we'll be working through those transition arrangements over the next couple of months as well.
Okay, good. It'd be nice to see her back. That'd be great. I'll just go around everyone all the time. Catherine, is there any other items that you think we need to cover? Michael Hartney?
No, thank you.
Hugo?
Not for me, thank you.
Peter Gray, anything that we need to have done that we haven't
no,
already?
That's fine, except the next meeting is 16th of March.
16th of March, okay. Hang on a minute. Let me just check my efficient situation of other meetings. Yeah, 16th of March is good. Pension board, let's write that down. Okay, Mario, anything else? No. Okay, well, I've got no other items. Nice to see everyone and talk, and I'll see you all on the 16th of March, if not before.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Have a nice day.
Yeah, cheers, Jonathan.
Bye.
Bye.